The strangest thing about inheriting my uncle's antique shop wasn't the mildew or the tax bill that came with it. It was that the shop already knew my name. When Nathaniel Webb's funeral ended and I folded his wool coat into the trunk of my car, I thought I understood what an inheritance looked like. A headache, a building that needed work, a basement full of things no one had dusted in decades. I did not expect to be handed a key stamped with the shop's name, and to find, on the front counter, a leather-bound ledger with yesterday's dust still clinging to its spine, and inside, an ink line dated months from now that read, "Portrait of Caleb Webb, to be acquired December 20th. You believe it was a joke. I did at first. Nathaniel loved the theatrics of a good story. He respected pedigree, of China, of whiskey, and of family myth. He would have enjoyed the dramatic reveal. He would have enjoyed watching me jump. Only it wasn't his handwriting. The entry bloomed into existence in front of me, the ink feathering as if it had been set down by a trembling hand moments earlier. I had stood in the doorway with the key in my palm, and when I turned the ledger's page, a fresh line bled at the bottom, as if someone, or something, had just finished writing. That's how this starts if you inherit Webb's curiosities: a quiet shop, a ledger labeled current stock, and a string of rules folded into an envelope left for the new keeper. They're legalistic and oddly specific, as if an accountant and a superstition had married and produced a to-do list. Rule 1. Check the ledger at 7, morning and evening. Read the new entries aloud and acknowledge them. Rule 2. Never remove items not listed as stock. People not on the ledger are not customers. Rule 3. The storage room is open only between 10 and 4. Do not enter outside those hours. Rule 4. Do not sell items that are not listed at the time of the transaction. Rule 5. If a portrait in the shop smiles, leave immediately. Do not attempt to take it down. The envelope wasn't particularly ornate, just thick paper and a note pinned to the front in my uncle's careful scrawl. Rules for operating Webb's curiosities. Underneath, a second line in a different hand, tremulous and dark as stained iron, read, "Follow them. They are the shop's terms." I read those rules twice, because sarcasm is a reflex and disbelief needs rehearsing. It felt ridiculous until 7 that evening, when the clock on the wall, an overlarge, earnest grandfather clock Nathaniel insisted was functionally antique, chimed, and I realized I'd promised myself I'd be practical about the place. Sell the building, cash in whatever was behind the counter, move on. The ledger was a minor inconvenience, except the ledger has a way of making itself an inconvenience. At 7 on the dot, I opened the ledger and said the words, "I acknowledge new entries." I meant to sound sardonic, performative even.
The shop smelled like dust and orange peel, and something older, dried roses perhaps, tucked between books in someone else's life. The light from the street lamps made the glass in the display cases look like shallow ponds. I read the list aloud. A brass compass, a child's music box, a silver spoon. The music box, which I had already handled earlier in the day, gave a single sharp note and then another, as if it had been wound and released for the first time in a century. The needle of the brass compass tilted a fraction and then steadied, and a single silver spoon in a case on the shelf that I had passed a dozen times glittered with an alarming polish I didn't remember. The ink that had been blank a moment before now held a neat new line. Music box, operable, present. When the shop performs for you like that, when the inanimate pays attention and answers, you stop treating it like a pile of inherited junk. You start treating it like a thing with rules. I don't want to make it melodramatic. For 2 days I tried to treat the ledger like a broken vending machine, an annoyance with a capacity to surprise. I came in at 6:45, cleaned the counter, replaced price tags with the bluntness of someone used to spreadsheets and not spirits. At 7, I read aloud and acknowledged. Things happened. Entries that weren't there wrote themselves on the page. Items I didn't recall seeing appeared in display cases. A quiet sadness seemed to move through the shop like cold air slipping under a door. The second morning, a woman came in who did not look around the way customers do. She walked straight to a back shelf and held a small locket in both hands, inspecting the engravings. She was older, 30 years older than me at least, with a shawl pinned across her hair and an odor of tea and mothballs. She asked without looking up, "Do you still have Mrs. Larkin's locket?" I didn't know a Mrs. Larkin. I checked my ledger mechanically before I answered, because the rules are habit-forming, and because Nathaniel's note was sitting open on the counter like an accusation. There was no record of the woman in the ledger, no entry to match the locket in her hands. "I don't think so," I said, keeping my palm on the ledger. "If it's not listed, I can't sell it." Her fingers tightened on the chain like she was trying to remember a name that wouldn't come. She smoothed the locket with the reverence of someone who had worn it long enough to forget the face inside. "I'm not asking to buy," she said. She smiled, and you could see the way a name surfaces in someone's memory. "I thought perhaps you knew where it had been kept." She left without another word, the bell above the door tugging at the air behind her like a fishhook. That afternoon, the ledger had a new line I swear had not been there before.
Locket, Mrs. Larkin, acquired 12/02/2012. The date was years in the past.
The ink was an old brown, the writer's pen moving with a smudged slowness, as if written by someone who was tired. I asked myself if the shop was keeping a catalog of things it had taken, or things it had absorbed in time. I asked whether refuses like "not a customer" were meant as a shield or as a label. Hiram Thatcher told me that he knew where the edges of the shop's rules met with human failure. Hiram is the sort of local you learn about when you buy property. He feeds on rumor but pays the bills by fixing roofs. He'd come by within the first week because rumor had a way of traveling from tongue to woodwork, and I had not yet learned how to keep mine shut. "You should have left those rules sealed until you were certain you wanted them," Hiram said, palms on the counter, leaning like a man who had spent more nights than he wanted out under roofs that had sagged away from better times. He had the look of someone who's been through a getting and a giving. "My father told stories about your family, said the shop keeps accounts you can't read without paying in flesh." I bristled. Of course I did. People add color to a story to make it more interesting. People feed themselves on the theatrical and sell the rest for their own comfort. But Hiram's voice didn't have the relish of a drunk storyteller. He kept it low, like a man measuring wind. "Does it take people?" I asked. It was a stupid question. The ledger had lines like "acquisitions," the portrait of me predicted for December 20th. The music box had played itself. The sensible part of my brain wanted to assign all of it to grief haze and the gentrified romance of an antique shop. The practical part wanted to call a lawyer and a locksmith. "Not always," he said, "but it doesn't ask permission from us when it wants something. It simply writes it down and does what it always does." He tapped the ledger with a knuckle itched with old scars. "My aunt sold a vase there once. Next week, a man came around asking for payment he claimed your family had owed him. Said he came for the vase. He got paid, and then he disappeared." Hiram shrugged with a resigned complexity that made my scalp prickle. The townsfolk prefer their legends with edges blurred by shame and time. "I'm telling you this because you're a Webb and because you're new. You could refuse it, but those that tried, well, you don't want to be the one that tests a thing that's got centuries of answers. If there's a right answer to inherited superstition, it's to treat it with paperwork and caution. I did what you expect a man of my age and temperament to do. I did not storm out immediately. I instead locked the storage room. The storage room sits behind a door with a frosted glass pane that reads "Storehouse" in capital letters from another era. I thought it was the usual kind of locked history. The boxes, the forgotten display pieces, the unpaid bills. There is a hand-lettered sign nailed to the door that reads "Storage hours, 10 to 4, and underneath that, in Nathaniel's tidy script, "Do not enter after hours." In my ego, I assumed it was a joke or a prudent insurance clause. It was the fourth morning before I pressed my ear to the frosted glass and told myself it was the right time to see what long-locked things tasted like. I went in at 10 on the dot because the rules persuade you into punctuality. The space smelled of sawdust and mildew and old paper. Rows of shelves were labeled with dates like tombstones. August 1896, Estate of L. Corbin, Box 12, Portraits. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of storing that is what keeps a house from collapsing, the slow weight of things that remember. I found, wedged behind a stack of cloths, a smaller ledger bound in cracked calfskin. It was older than the ledger on the counter and smelled like tobacco and iron. The cover had a darkened imprint. If you bent the light right, you could read the name Webb stitched in with a thread that had gone silver with time. The first page was blank. The second page had a line written in a hand that made my hand seem newly clumsy. Contract between Ezra Webb and proprietor of the High Places, 1847. I had heard the name Ezra in family anecdotes, an ancestor who'd opened the shop and done something practical with a sharp suit and a sharp eye. I had not been prepared for a paper that in the same breath called someone proprietor and appended a year like a claim, 1847. The ink was old and stubborn, the letters looped like a formal signature. There was a folded envelope beneath the ledger, thick with a rustle like dried leaves. On the flap, a name, Eliza Hartwell. The letters had been pressed as if someone hoped their initials would be enough. I sat on a crate and unfolded the envelope like a man taking a breath in the dark. The letter inside was less a single sheet than a packet of notes and diagrams and an urgency that had smudged corners because it had been handled by many hands. It smelled faintly of rose oil and cedar. The handwriting inside was not Nathaniel's. It was smaller, precise, and determined. If you're reading this and you think you're entitled to the truth, you should know I had the same thought. The truth often reads like a confession written by someone who didn't expect to be read.
Eliza's hand did not ask for pity. It did not puff itself with holiness. It offered information and a single brittle instruction that felt at once like relief and a hung blade. She began with ledger entries, lists of names, dates, things marked acquired. She annotated margins with little notes, attempts to burn the ledger, the fires that wouldn't take, the ways that family members were lost to debts that had nothing to do with money. Her pages described patterns. When an item with a person's likeness appears, the ledger writes the date, and the consequence follows.
A portrait hangs for weeks. The ledger sets a date for its acquisition. Before that date, the subject of the portrait is likely to vanish. She wrote about the not customers, people who came to take things because they were owed something, how they were not to be sold to, because denying them is what kept their demands from anchoring to the shop's list. The stoic economics of it was chilling. The ledger did not ask permission. It recorded and enforced. And then there was a page where her handwriting tightened like a fist. "There is a way to break it," she wrote. "There is a way, but it requires someone who is not of our blood. The things that bind us to the proprietor of the high places respond to blood. Fire of kin will only anneal the contract. A non-blood flame, someone who carries no web, must be the hand that severs the ledger." The letter went on, in less confident strokes. "Destroy the portrait first. Make certain it is unsmiling when the flame touches. Then the ledger. Burn the ledger. The ledger will fight. The ledger will force illusions. The hand that burns must be willing and must not stand under our signet. You will be tempted to do it yourself. You must not. You will be burned, and it will take you." I read these lines until the words blurred. Then I read them again because the world had a new weight, and I needed to know it anchored somewhere besides my own head. The envelope contained two more things: a sketch of the shop's back room showing a hidden partition, and a note folded into a scrap that simply said, "If you cannot find a non-blood, ask Abby Putnam." Abby Putnam. The name was familiar, like the taste of coin. She is local, an artist, somebody who paints faces for tavern wallets and teaches children at the community center. She is not a Webb. The suggestion felt like a key turned in a lock I didn't know I had. There, in the dim of the storage room, I felt something like clarity and something like a new panic. If the ledger's ink was a ledger of debt, Eliza's packet was an index to an escape clause. But her words were frayed by fear. She had tried and failed. She had left instructions folded like apologies for those who would come after. I closed the ledger and the envelope and sat very still on the crate until the light over the workbench blurred into a halo. My hands were brown with dust and the odd sweat of someone who has had a memory become a responsibility. The shop hummed with the small noises of things settling, an old chair scraping, the creak of a floorboard where someone else's steps had once traced a path. It matters in storytelling and in living that you hear the clock when time keeps its own counsel. The ledger had set dates, and in the margins there were names like contracts. If the portrait bore my name with a date, then a timeline was marching toward me, and the shop was taking attendance. I thought about calling someone: police, a priest, a historian with an appetite for the dramatic.
I thought about replacing the lock and moving out the next day. I thought about selling the building to a chain store and handing the ledger to someone in a suit who would wrap it in legalese and a restraining order. Instead, I folded Eliza's pages and slid them into my jacket, because the weight of them was the first thing I have ever carried that felt sensible: information. Outside, the afternoon had turned to a brittle blue where winter had just begun to sharpen the trees. I went home to sleep and dreamt of a brass compass and a music box chiming under the water. I dreamt of being listed in a book I had never seen, and of my face looking back at me from a frame whose mouth was patient and knowing. 2 nights later, at 7, I followed the rules again, because habit now felt like the only thin cord between me and whatever collected debt the shop kept. I opened the ledger and spoke the phrase. I acknowledged the new entries. The ink moved as if taking breath, and beneath the neat new lines was another, darker scrawl that made my stomach dip. Portrait, Caleb Webb, scheduled December 20th. Portrait to be acquired. Skeleton, matching size and age. Those words hit like a hand. The ledger didn't bury its meaning in euphemism. It wrote the thing plainly: skeleton, matching size and age, as if it were cataloging a closet rather than naming a life. I closed the book because there are ruptures you don't want to stare at, and because when the shop runs the ledger's particulars, it is best not to be the one to give it your voice. After that, I stopped being sarcastic about it. People asked me if I felt watched.
They asked if I planned to move. They asked if I had already sold the building to pay off the estate taxes. I answered in ways that summoned normalcy. I made an appointment with a lawyer. I inventoried the front display. I painted the back door a color the town hadn't seen since Nathaniel's father painted it. But these things were papering over a fissure, and every time I turned to the ledger, it widened. When I finally met Abby, it was in a bar that smelled like fried something and earnest conversations. She was 29 with paint on her cuffs and charcoal smudged under her fingernails. She had the sad, practical face of someone who knows how to do things with her hands. I told her I had a problem with a ledger and a portrait, and how terrible it would be, really, to have your likeness hanging in a shop catalogued for December, and I waited for the indulgent laughter or a dismissive word. She didn't laugh. She cocked her head like someone making a calculation, and then said, without the performance of being the character in a ghost story, "I don't want to be dramatic, but I've painted things that watched me while I worked. That tends to bother the canvas." She bought me a beer and listened.
When I described the ledger and the portrait and Eliza's instruction about the outsider, there was a long, braced silence where the jukebox under our conversation seemed to slow. "You sound like you've read the right things at the wrong time," Abby said. "It sounds to me like your uncle was a man who understood rules better than people. But rules are tools. Sometimes they're shields, sometimes they're locks." She sipped her beer and tapped ash into an ashtray. "If Eliza Hartwell wrote that, I'd take it seriously. She was practical. She was clever. She spelled things out. I'd believe her before I'd believe some town rumor." When she said those words, I realized why Nathaniel had left the ledger open on the counter. He wanted someone to take up the matter. He wanted someone to be practical. He also wanted, perhaps, to be believed in his absence. The thought made my throat tight in a way that had nothing to do with thrift store dust. Abby agreed to come look at the shop the next day. I told her about the rule that portraits must be left alone if they smile, and about the storage room hours, and she laughed once at the absurd specificity of it, and then grew thoughtful. "You do understand," she said, "that if Eliza says the hand that burns it must be non-blood, that's not a metaphor. That's a condition built into the thing's logic. The proprietor set the terms, maybe knows the chemistry of old bargains or the superstition's grammar better than we do. It doesn't matter why. It matters that it's true here." She folded her hands like someone resolving to go inside a storm with a flashlight. "There are other small details that make the ledger feel less like a poem and more like a machine. It never explicitly seeks vengeance in a moral way. It catalogs, and the world follows. It is neither cruel nor merciful. It is inexorable, like a tide." On the third day after Abby's visit, an entry appeared that made me feel the way you feel when you're late for a train you imagine didn't exist. Portrait, Caleb Webb, December 20th. Skeleton matching, anticipated. Signed, in an ink I now recognized as the ledger's hand, proprietor of the high places. I learned to keep a record of times, not precise to the minute maybe, but enough so that when something happened, I could say to myself that I had been here and awake, and that the world had not conspired with my memory to produce this grief. There's something calming about keeping a calendar, even when the dates are threats. Eliza's packet had another folded sheet with a map of the shop in crude clinical strokes. It circled a partition in the storage room and noted a loose board under a crate where the ledger and the contract might be kept. It also included a note that read, "If you burn the portrait, it will scream. It may freeze the room afterward. Do not be frightened by the color of the flame. It will be wrong. Trust the hand that is not ours."
This sentence ended in a mark like a cross between a signature and a caution. There was no instruction about how to make fire or what to do with the flames. It was an instruction more ethical than technical, a prescription that named who must act, not how they must act. You will feel foolish if you've never believed. You will feel foolish, and you will be justified. I did not believe fully. I believed enough to be careful and to make plans. That's how the human mind arranges itself in the presence of a ledger that writes its future, part reasoned logistics and part fear that the world will keep its promises, no matter how unwanted. For the next week, the shop was a study in small, inconvenient miracles. The compass turned. The music box played in the middle of the night, as if someone had wound it with an invisible hand. A pair of porcelain dolls appeared in a case my uncle forbade me to open. The ledger kept a clean set of accounts that did not match what I had intended. Every morning and evening, the ledger had new lines. I read them aloud and watched as the shop obeyed its own bureaucracy. And always there was the portrait. Somewhere in the back room at first, a face I did not immediately recognize, then a feeling like a photograph of the future that had been tucked between the pages of an old book. The longer I worked in the shop, the more certain I became that portraits there did not hang by accident. If the ledger set a date for an item's acquisition, the shop would prepare. There was a photograph of me in the ledger's margin once I'd been named. Not a literal photograph, but an entry that matched my height and the scar above my left eyebrow. It described a frame, the wood to be dark walnut with a gilt leaf, the glass slightly convex. It said when it would be hung and how it would have been painted. My mouth set in a neutral line, my eyes watching, my hands folded, my clothing in a way that made me feel historically out of time. The entry was precise, down to the way the light would catch the enamel in my irises. In private, I practiced a response to the ledger that had the form but not the conviction of defiance. I locked the door, taped the windows, replaced light bulbs with the warmest I could find. I wrote to the lawyer and set an appointment for the following week. I called Abby and told her the ledger said the portrait would be acquired on December 20th, and that I was trying to arrange for her to be the one who would stand on the right side of a thing called the proprietor. She answered with one sentence that I replay sometimes when I feel myself shrinking back into safety. If the rules say non-blood, I'll be non-blood for you. It was not melodramatic. It was a person offering help in a way that people who care do. In the weeks that followed, I realized that the shop had a way of making people reveal themselves. It made them useful or made them confess their own cowardice. Abby made a choice, Hiram made a warning, Eliza made a map.
Nathaniel left instructions. On a cold afternoon in late November, I found another envelope shoved beneath the ledger on the counter. It was thinner, worn at the edges the way a page that has been read often is worn. Inside was a single note in Nathaniel's hand. If you must, follow the rules. If you can't, refuse to play. The edges of the paper were stiff with oil from how often he had held it, like a guide worn into the palm. I put the note in my pocket and went to the back room. The portrait was there now, leaning against a stack of crates in an oak frame whose gilt leaf had been dulled by soot from an earlier fire. When I opened the crate to move it, curiosity is stubborn, I felt the frame warm as if it had been held in a palm and carried. The warmth was an odd animal thing against my skin, not hot, but alive. The eyes in the portrait were painted in such a way they seemed to follow, not with movement, but with a readiness to change. For the first time, the mouth seemed not exactly neutral, but set in a line that could, with a small tilt, become a smile. I remembered Rule 5, that if a portrait smiles, you must leave immediately, and it felt suddenly like the most sensible rule of all. If a painted mouth alters its expression and the instruction is to run, that's something you do not debate. It is not a superstition. It is an escape plan. I wrapped the portrait in shrouding blankets and slid it into an empty crate, thinking of Eliza's letters and wondering how anyone ever convinces a stranger to do a violent thing for them. The idea that a hand outside the family must perform the burning had the taste of a moral contrivance. What do you owe a thing that keeps accounts? Who pays the penalty when a family binds itself to a world that writes names into a book? I keep records now that look less like spreadsheets and more like prayer lists. I have a page with dates and times, 7, 10, 4, like stations one might pass through to stay alive. I check the ledger twice a day and say the words aloud. I refuse to sell to anyone who is not recorded when I can help it. Sometimes that means customers leave miffed. Sometimes it means a woman like the one who wanted the locket finds her way to a different store. Sometimes it means Hiram mutters that the town has become more watchful and less charitable. And still, on the ledger's line where my name sits with a date, there is the absence of anything but certainty. The ledger is not moral. It does not bully or excuse. It catalogs. It promises. When I closed the storage room door that final time, with Eliza's packet folded under my arm and Nathaniel's note in my jacket, I felt the shop watch me the way a patient animal watches someone unfamiliar touch its den. The floorboard sighed, a sound ancient and human. The grandfather clock chimed 7, a clear peal that felt like a bell in the ribs. I don't know what courage looks like until you are asked to watch someone else's back. Maybe it is not courage at all. Maybe it is negligence or curiosity or the wrong sort of stubbornness. When Abby came the next afternoon, she carried a bag of canvases and a look like she had decided to stand on the very edge of the thing that would either end us or let us leave. "You realize you've chosen December 20th as a deadline the ledger didn't pick for poetic reasons?" she said, as we stood with the portrait between us. Her fingers hovered over the frame, as if she was learning a face as an artist learns faces, by holding them in her hands and testing light across cheekbones. "I'd say the ledger chose me the way a tide chooses a gull," I said. "It wrote my name. It meant it." Abby didn't need proof. She needed the ledger, the portrait, and perhaps the story of Eliza Hartwell. When I handed her the packet, she read and then read again. The lines about the non-blood flame were the ones she read last, like someone cataloging the thing she was being asked to be. She looked at me and said, simply,
If we do this, we do it the way Eliza said. We do what she says. Her voice had the steadiness of someone who knows how to make things stop looking like accidents and start looking like plans. We were, in that moment, a two-person plan standing in a shop that had recorded our names already in someone else's ink. It felt ridiculous and inevitable all at once. The ledger's entries are impartial, but their consequences are intimate. Eliza's packet offered a slice of hope in a ledger-cataloged world. It told me that the ledger can be undone, if the terms are met. I set the portrait back against the crate and locked the storage room. Even wrapped as it was, the frame's warmth seemed to pulse beneath linen like a heartbeat you could hear if you leaned in close enough. It made me think that perhaps the shop did not simply want to take. Perhaps it wanted continuity. Perhaps it wanted a ledger that would never be left blank. There is a distinct kind of fright that is composed of equal parts duty and the fear of being seen as cowardly. It's the fear of inheriting a thing and then refusing in public to be the sort of person who would finish what their ancestor began. It is what made me consider for a long minute walking away from the ledger, closing down the place, letting the building stand empty until someone else wrote my name in the margin. When I asked Abby if she was certain, she laughed in that way that says yes and no, and also I know what I am doing. I'm certain I'm not your blood, she said. I'm certain I don't like being told I can't help. I'm certain I would rather be the hand that burns than the one that looks the other way. She tapped the packet of Eliza's notes. I want to know what you're like when you're brave rather than when you're practical. I didn't know if being brave would make anything better. All I knew was that standing still had never helped the people in the ledger's margins.
People vanish, and then the ledger names it again, as if the shop was making its own sort of order. That night I slept poorly. The clock on the wall chimed in my dreams, an old man counting heartbeats. I woke at 3 with the sensation of someone watching the doorway, and maybe that's simply being in a drafty old building with a quilt over your chest, or maybe it's the building remembering names and feeling you're next. When morning came, I walked to the shop and checked the ledger as I always did. There was an entry that made me drop the pen in the quiet of the shop. Hiram Thatcher, account settled, acquired, 11/22/2012. It read like an annotation of a life once subtracted. Hiram's eyes, when he read the ledger later on, had a hunted quality that made me understand the ledger is not abstract. I think when Hiram looked at the pages, he saw a future he had been granted or denied. He didn't say much. Men like him don't. He nodded and left a small paid-in-cash envelope on the counter, like an old habit. We had a plan now because Eliza had given us one, and because Abby had agreed without romance or heroics. The rules had become our map. We built the plan into a calendar and a ritual of small things, a bureaucracy of survival. The ledger kept its dates like teeth. We put up our own signs to keep from being swallowed. Abby and I marked December 20th in thick ink on a page I carried in my wallet. We rehearsed routes through the shop so we could move without tripping over displays or knocking a bell that might wake whatever heard shop noises as summons. We set a bag of blankets in a crate near the partition Eliza had fetched. Hiram brought by an extra padlock and a length of rope cut from a boat he'd once repaired. He did not believe less. He believed more in practical precautions. He said nothing about being frightened in the way townspeople sometimes say nothing because fear sounds like gossip when spoken aloud. It is a strange tenderness preparing to be unmade. You take inventory not only of things, but of yourself. I measured how many shirts I owned, how many nights in a row I could wake and still stand upright. Abby measured linseed oil by feel, the way painters learn to hold something so it stops slipping. We were both precise, because precision feels like defense. There were smaller fights along the way that meant nothing to a ledger, and everything to two people standing too close to a thing that lists futures. The most ordinary argument was over lighting. Abby wanted no more than a candle, a single flame so the portrait's face wouldn't catch too quickly, and so the smoke would be controllable. I wanted a torch, sturdy, sudden, sure. We argued like people who love schedules. In the end, our compromise was the kind of tool-laden neutrality that two people who do not yet trust fate can make. She would light the portrait with a single match, crush it out if it felt wrong, and then hand me the ledger that I would hold back until the flame answered. We had to time it not only for the ledger's rules, but for mundane things. The hours for the storage room, the shop's business hours, the town's awareness. Eliza's packet was adamant on quantities it would not name. Non-blood, destroy the portrait first, do not be burned, and tentative on the rest. She had been shrewd enough to understand that any plan had to survive the people who would enact it, not the intentions laid down on paper. We made a list of contingencies. Someone would have to take the phone calls if the shop rang. Someone would have to sit in the front window to look ordinary. Abby insisted on a third plan. If anything went wrong, run to the square and make the wrongness public. Secrecy is currency for bargains. Our countercurrency would be witnesses. By early December, the ledger's ink tightened like a fist. It began to write with a kind of impatient economy. Names of things we had never seen appeared. Walnut Frame, Oak Leaf Guild, Prepped. I would check at 7 in the morning and evening and read the words aloud, the sentence like a stitch in a wound. At 7 in the evening, more often than not, small things would answer. The music box would begin a single trembling phrase. The compass needle would find a new north. A folded photograph might slide between books like a letter being returned to its owner. Once, a mason's chisel that had not been out in decades rang when struck against the display case, as though someone had plucked it for attention. Twice, I tried to shortcut the rules in ways I told myself were reasonable. Once, when a man I recognized from the market came in late with the old air of someone expecting credit, I refused to serve him because he was not in the ledger. He left angry. 3 days later, Hiram told me the man had not returned to the town. I do not know if my refusal and his leaving are the same thing. I only know that when the ledger writes in neat rows, the edges between refusal and consequence blur. The shop does not ask permission. It records, and the world answers. The ledger loves pattern. Its entries across generations are almost tender in their thoroughness. Ezra's first deals went in like lists of purchases. A scale, a ledger, something that read like peace of mind. Later pages, crisper and more urgent, turned personal. Mrs. Larkin, Lockett, acquired 12/02/2012. Hiram Thatcher, accounts settled, acquired 11/22/2012. The contract in the older ledger named the proprietor of the high places and stamped dates into a design that looked like a family tree saving its less profitable branches. Eliza's notes described previous attempts at breaking the bargain with the kind of attention that looks like mourning.
She wrote about a cousin who set the ledger on a bonfire and woke to find the pages charred, but the writing intact, and the cousin's wife gone. She described a night when there had been a scream so high and long that it had knocked glass loose from frames across the shop. In her margins, she drew a little diagram of hands, 2 hands, one blood, one not, and drew a line between them with a small lightning mark at the center. The lines were less formula and more plea. You need a hand that does not carry our name. On December 17th, the portrait began to lean forward. It was a slight thing, first, a perception more than motion. A day later, I caught the painted eyelids in a slant that could be read as attention. By the 19th, there was a suggestion in the curve of the mouth that it might find a smile if nudged. I think paintings are patient, like some animals. They wait until their moment, and then they become something else. Rule 5, if a portrait smiles, leave immediately, was not merely advice. It was the shortest version of an instruction manual for surviving the final hour. We tried to keep the mouth neutral. Abby, being an artist, talked to the portrait the way artists talk to faces. She brushed away dust in certain places, propped the frame so the light would hit a cheek and not the mouth. It felt like bribery. We were bribing oil and varnish to keep still. The paradox lodged under the ribs. We needed to destroy it whole and unsmiling. We were trying not to create the very thing the rules said would force us to run. The night before the 20th, I slept little. That is a small confession and a large one. I kept waking at random times to check my phone for messages from Abby or Hiram. At 3:12 a.m., I dreamed the clock stopped and someone tall and thin wrote my name in a margin with a feather. I woke with the taste of copper and an impatience to get back to the shop and check that nothing had moved. In the shop at dawn, the portrait leaned further into the crate, eyes solemn and almost patient. It surprised me how calm that made me feel. It was as if, in being painted, the world had already decided something about me and was allowing me to act. We did a dry run on the 20th in daylight, moving through each step with the slow tempo of a stage crew. Abby tied the picture's blanket in a loose knot so she could unwrap it without fumbling. Hiram stood at the door with his padlock and rope, and a look like he was guarding a place he had once watched burn. We placed 2 chairs to keep crates from toppling. I touched the ledger in its place on the counter and felt ink whisper under my fingers, a sort of waiting. At 5:30 p.m., the town's light thinned. People closed up shops. The square emptied. I remember jotting the time because it felt like an anchor. We locked the display cases. Abby took the portrait from the crate and set it on an easel in the center of the back room. It looked small in that space, like a person folded into itself.
She stood with it for a long moment and then stepped back. There are moments you wish you could describe with the economy of someone who had chosen them. This was not one. Everything was loud and ragged and somehow too precise.
like the way the world narrows to a point just before thunder. Hiram left us the keys and the rope and the quiet understanding that he would not be part of the last act. His kind of courage is tidy, practical precautions and a willingness to remove oneself. He kissed the top of my head in a way that felt like a benediction from someone with no priestly claims, and left. At 6:52 p.m., because the ledger insists on form, I checked it. I read the new entries aloud because the rules had become the syntax of our days. I acknowledged the new entries. The ink across the page had darkened. Portrait, Caleb Webb, to be acquired 12/20. The line added a single word beneath it that I did not remember until later. Pending. Pending was worse. Pending is an engine that keeps spinning until it consumes what it is fed. Abby took a single match out of a paper. I had expected her to hesitate. I expected the sort of dramatic breath that people who carry danger always take. She did not. She brought the match to the wick of the candle we had placed nearby and let the flame catch. The small flame matched her hands, steady and unshowy. She lifted the match to the portrait's lower edge. Her fingers brushed the frame. The frame warmed at once, not with the heat of the match, but with something that felt like recognition. There came then the sound I can still hear if I close my eyes. A music box chord high and thin. Then silence. Then a long, low note that sounded like the floor settling. For a second, everything hovered. The portrait, the flame, my breath. Then the oil caught in a way the pages had warned us it would. The color of the fire was wrong. It wasn't orange so much as a white blue that hummed like a struck glass. It licked the varnish and the face in the portrait. Abby watched the mouth as it did what oil and time had allowed it to do. The painted mouth did not break into a smile in the way a living mouth smiles. Instead, it curved in a little, like a hinge giving under pressure. Eliza's note had told us to make certain it was unsmiling when the flame touched. The portrait was not smiling. It was not offering us an exit. It was only the face of someone who had been caught between acts. For an instant, I thought we had succeeded in the calm way people call success when they are still in the moment of decision. Then the shop exhaled. Heat and cold can happen at once in a small room with things that answer a ledger. The air around us dropped like a hand, and frost began to beat on the glass of the easel. A thin white powder drew along the air like breath. The candle's flame leaned and then became not simply flame, but a pillar of light that sang with color.
The painting's varnish sighed and shriveled. The canvas made a sound like paper tearing softly, but not entirely a human sound. Abby did not scream. She held the portrait and watched the paint blister into ash and then peel like bark. Then it screamed. I do not use that line for effect. The sound came out of the painting like an animal used to being hung on a wall and then being moved. It was thin and high and wrong enough that the hairs along my forearms lifted. We had been warned of a scream. The warning had been clinical in Eliza's hand, but a real scream is its own geometry. The scream did not last long, a single sustained note that vibrated the beads of frost on the counters. It sounded almost like a word. The portrait shivered and then let go of itself and collapsed inward into a pile of curling ash and a small dark hill of soot. The crate trembled as if the shop had swallowed an incredulous laugh. For a second, the floor beneath the easel shook, a slow animal motion deep under the boards. I can see now that the shop did not respond with malice so much as with the mild irritation of something that expected its rules to be followed. The ledger wanted the portrait burned. It wanted the action to be performed by a hand outside the family. It had been waiting for this condition for generations. When the painting fell to ash, something else happened. The ledger on the counter, old, patient, accustomed to writing futures, began to swirl. The entries in the cream paper resisted at first, like letters trying to hold breath. Then, as if in response to the heat's wrongness and the blood on our hands meaning something, black ink bled like smoke along its own lines. It was then that the ledger fought. The ledger's fight was not like the scream. It was not a sound so much as a series of motions through the room. The air filled with the scent of roses burning and something metallic, a smell like old coins and cold iron. The music box under the counter that had not been wound in ages began to play by itself, the single brittle hymn of a mechanism that had been waiting for a hand. The grandfather clock's chimes fell out of rhythm and then stopped altogether. The shop seemed to undulate, boards sighing, glass trembling. I do not remember if I was moving toward the ledger because I had planned to tear the contract pages or because I needed to feel like I could act. I had Eliza's instruction in my pocket and Nathaniel's note folded like a small worn talisman. The older ledger, Ezra's, was still in the storage room. If the contract had any physicality left, it lived there.
It seemed obvious that tearing something that carried blood meaning might be the last thing a Webb could do without being swallowed. The note had not said we must not tear it. It had said the hand that burns must be non-blood. So I moved toward the hidden partition. There are things you can do in a room with a blue fire and falling ash that you cannot easily explain later.
I found the seam Eliza had sketched. I pried the loose board with a flat screwdriver and a strength the shop drew from me. Behind the board was a small cavity, and within it, wrapped in waxed cloth, the contract pages, thin, brittle, and smelling of iron. My hands shook. They were, unmistakably, blood hands. The paper within had names, Ezra's, Nathaniel's, and names of ancestors with their own little notations about times and items. The ink that had been a ledger's tidy script now looked like a ledger's teeth. I did the only thing I could that did not involve flame. I tore. I did not tear with cruelty. I tore with the slowness of someone unpicking a stitch that had to be pulled apart. I ripped my finger along a fold and felt a pain that was less physical than incising, like a family memory opening. Pages came apart. I held pieces in my palm, my face staring back from a faded incline, then a line where a date had once been, and then a name. I ripped each page with the deliberate, ugly mercy of someone removing their own signature. Each tear was an admission. My family had consented. I would not. The shop answered to this in a way I had not expected. The frost in the room retracted, like a soft thing being pulled back by an unseen hand. The white-blue flame over the portrait shrieked, brighter, and then nodded like lightning. Abby, who had been only inches from the ash pile, turned with a look that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with belonging. She had the match in her fingers, the ember alive on its tip. She had done what Eliza said. She had been asked to be non-blood, and she had agreed. She had been told that the hand that burns must not carry our name, and she had held that condition in herself as if holding a promise. In one movement she strode from the easel, gathered the ledger from the counter where it had been rattling its teeth, and held it above the flame that still vicked the portrait's ashes. You are warned in Eliza's letters that the ledger will resist. It will make illusions and try to frighten you into retreat. It will conjure voices, call names, and make the world move in the way that means you are small and alone. Abby did not flinch. She set the ledger in the flame, and for a single instant it was as if the shop inhaled and held. The paper caught. The ledger did not go gently. The ink flared like a net of black lines, and the flames burned a color that was not fire as I know it. It was a winter fire, a flame with the sound of a struck bell, and a color like the very far edge of dawn. The ledger writhed, and the letters tore into each other as if pain made them run. The music box under the counter that had played the thin hymn now rang louder and louder until it sounded like an orchestra in a tin room. Chairs scraped the floor, and a current passed through the shop that felt like a remembering. Then something happened that I will never forget. The contract pages in my hands, those I had torn, began to crumble, not into ash, but into threads of paper that looked like a map unweaving. The last name on the last page I had ripped to pieces, a name I had carried like a coin my whole life, slid free and fluttered into the ledger's flame. Abby, who had not been blood, tossed what remained of the ledger into the bright wrong fire, and it accepted the pages as if they belonged to a world that had been waiting for such permission. The sound was not quite like relief. It was like a chord being resolved. The shop convulsed with light and noise. For a breath the walls seemed to breathe and then hold. The music box clattered to silence, as if its mechanism had been offered something too much to continue. The floor stopped trembling. The air cleared. The frost melted from the glass and formed a small puddle on the counter. The candle that had been Abby's match burned down to a nub. The portrait's ashes were cold when they fell. The pile had the faint smell of cedar and old roses, and not the iron smell of the ledger. The only residue left on the easel was a film of dark particle like soot, and a tiny fleck of paint that looked like an eye. When I reached out with hands that had just lost a signature, the ash smudged on my finger like a memory I could no longer hold. We stood in the shop with the spent embers of something that had bound our family for generations, and felt both foolish and holy. It felt at once like the end of an auction and a remembrance. Outside the town was still. One of the neighbors later told me they had seen a light through the shop's back window and thought a tree had caught on fire. No one came. No one watched. The shop had wanted witnesses, and in the end we supplied them for ourselves. There were immediate consequences. The ledger's entries,
The ones that had once been precise as tax forms were gone. Portrait, Caleb Webb, crossed out in jagged ink. Where once there had been a clean line saying Hiram Thatcher, acquired 11/22/2012, there was now only an empty space. A string of other names had been excised as if someone had decided not to charge a debt. The music box beneath the counter was silent, but no less there. Objects that had arrived in the days leading up to the burning, dolls, a compass, remained on the shelf but altered, like items someone had returned to after settling a bill. Hiram came back in the morning and put his hand on the counter and did not say much. He smelled of river and wood smoke, and he did not look as hunted. He told me simply, "You did what you did." Something else happened that made me both shiver and oddly thankful. The image of my face that had been described in the ledger's margin, the size, the scar, the mouth, was gone from the ledger. I went to the storage room in the days after and scavenged what had been left of the older ledger.
The edges were charred, but the pages that listed my name were mottled ruins with ink running like tired rivers. In the wet where paper had wept, my name blurred into nothing. It would be too neat to say that everything was forgiven and tidy. The shop did not release history in full. There were gaps and hollows that acted like black teeth in a smile. A few things had been taken in the past that were never returned. A woman called Mrs. Larkin's locket, some man's account. The ledger had been an accounting system for a thing that would not be coaxed into morality. What we had done was to loosen its grip on the present. That, in Eliza's words, was a beginning. After the flames, the town hummed with a rumor that filled in the edges. People asked questions about what had happened at Webb's Curiosities, why the lights had been on so late, why 3 people had been seen carrying a crate from the back into a car. The answers were a kind of velvet we wrapped around ourselves. We told some the practical version, about old frames catching and a match slipping. We told others the story of a portrait burned and a ledger destroyed. That story traveled faster than a ledger could list. It ran like music through the town, taking on the edges of other people's fears and comforting them. Nathaniel's note, "If you must, follow the rules. If you can't, refuse to play," sat in my pocket for a long time after. I read it and imagined what he meant. I think he had wanted someone to choose not to be the shop's next line item. He had wanted someone to be practical when the practicalness involved a mercy. He wanted someone to end the ledger's bookkeeping. We sold the building a year later, and in doing so performed the most ordinary anti-cursed thing anyone could propose. We gave it a life that was not ours to keep. The buyer was not a chain, but a couple from the coast who wanted to open a small plant and tea shop. They liked old wood and a front counter. They did not ask about the ledger or the portrait. In the sale, we tucked the blackened remains of the ledger into a lockbox and wrote a note to the trustee. Property sold as is, including any strange implements. The legal language pleased the lawyer and puzzled the new owners. We did not tell them everything. I kept Eliza Hartwell's packet and Nathaniel's note, and the fragments of the contract, the torn pages I could not with wincing throw away. I turned them over like coins in a palm when winter shadows grew long. The smallest mercy in all of it was that I could see now that secrecy is the thing that feeds bargains. By tearing the contract and burning the ledger in a non-blood hand, we had made the bargain public to the point that it could not anchor to a single family line. It was a relief to know that alliances and help and the simple decency of a stranger's help could change something that had once been thought immutable. I opened Hartwell Books the following autumn.
It felt right. I did not take the name like a benediction, but like a promise. Abby designed the shop's sign, and we painted it the exact green she preferred, which was somewhere between river and sage. People came for tea and for books, and for the quietness of pages, and the warmth of a lamp and a comfortable chair. Some afternoons, Abby painted portraits in a small corner near the back, with the kind of quiet that made the world feel less brittle. Sometimes she'd look up from a canvas and say, "You should be more brave about your novels." She meant something like daring to buy good paper and to keep good friends. The ledger's ashes were small and stubborn. I kept a petal of the charred paper pressed between a book I loved, Eliza's letter, folded and unread sometimes, as if refusing to know the world was a kind of care. Once, years later, on a rainy evening, I took the packet down and read her words as if someone had left a lantern on the porch for me to carry. She had signed A in the margin, like a small insistence that she existed. I would like to think I thanked her then. I would like to think I told her that her plan had worked, and that her plea for a non-blood hand had been answered by someone who swept floors and painted faces and liked the feel of damp charcoal under fingernails. There were lingering dreams. Once in a while I woke with the sensation of a face looking at me from across a room I was no longer in. I would go to the window and breathe the dark air and watch leaves skitter down the street. I never hung a portrait in my shop. I never allowed anyone to leave pictures of family faces on the wall. It felt like a small courtesy to the past and to the unknown.
Sometimes people ask me if I am grateful that I stayed. It would be strange to answer yes without admitting the shame that pushed me there as well. In the Ledger's years, things had happened that were ugly and that had not needed to. Choosing to act felt like choosing to be responsible for a thing my ancestors had done. It was small work, apologizing quietly to the town for secrets kept, telling stories to neighbors who would not judge, living openly where secrecy had been a currency. That is the smallest miracle, the one that steadies the heart. The world costs less when the accounts are shared. Abby and I do not talk about the Ledger every day. We trade the kind of jokes people make about odd inheritances, in the same way children make weather small beside the rain. We have a ritual instead. Every year on the 20th of December, we close the shop a little early and bring out a small dish of cider and stand in the doorway while the town light thins. We do not light a match. We stand and remember the shape of things and the people who chose to help. Once, the couple who now run the plant shop across the street left a circle of candles on the stoop as an accidental homage to the evening they once saw light through our back window. We called it a coincidence and let them keep it.
People write to me sometimes, strangers who found the story in a thread or an old newspaper, and tell me of dreams with ledgers and of caring for things with names. They ask if stories like mine are true in a way that wants to fold the world into a small, tidy moral. I answer with the same honesty I have tried to keep all along. Yes and no. Things that pull at the seams of our lives do exist, but they are made real by our attention and by our silence. We change them when we stop being quiet. The strangest rules of my inherited antique shop: check the ledger at 7 morning and evening and read new entries aloud. Never remove items not listed. The storage room is open only between 10 and 4. Do not sell items that are not listed. If a portrait smiles, leave. These are in the end a ledger's way of counting the living. The rules will outlast me, perhaps, if someone else makes the same careless choices my family did. They exist because someone once made a bargain they thought would buy something necessary. What I learned is this: bargains grow teeth when you keep them private. They can be cut down when enough people make the choice to face them together. Abby still paints, Hiram still fixes roofs, and now and then he checks the curtains for drafts with a mechanic's caution. Sometimes Nathaniel's old clock, which we never took to the new owners, ticks in a corner of my shop. It keeps its own time, slow and methodical. When I catch its sound, I think of the ledger and of the rule-bound life we were born into. I think about how we tore and how we burned, and how someone who was not our blood held the ledger until the fire took it. If you have a family thing that looks like a weight, ask a neighbor. If you find an old packet with a name like Eliza's, which is a beautiful and dangerous thing, read it and then carry it to someone who does not share your last name. Sometimes help must come from the unexpected, because the unexpected is what keeps us from repeating old debts. I tell this story not because I want to be believed as some sort of proof, but because secrecy is what keeps bargains alive. Naming what we were bound to unmade much of the bargain's teeth. There is agency in community. There is strength in admitting you cannot be the one to finish your ancestor's sentence. If you liked this, if you have your own strange inheritance, or an old house with an odd rule, or a family story that sits heavy in the margins, tell it in the comments. Share your story. And if you like hearing strange, true-feeling tales like this one, subscribe for more.